Get out of here and never come back, the millionaire uncle shouted at his orphaned nieces and nephews. Years later, he is left speechless when he sees them arriving in a limousine. The aroma of freshly baked lasagna filled the entire Reynolds household. Sophie stood on her tiptoes on the kitchen chair, her golden curls bouncing as she watched her mother carefully lift the steaming dish out of the oven. Thomas, her twin brother, was already strategically positioned beside the table, his green eyes shining with anticipation. "First, wash those hands, you little munchkins." Elena Reynolds smiled, adjusting her floral apron. The children raced toward the bathroom, their laughter echoing down the hallways of the house. "Last one there is a rotten egg," Thomas shouted, speeding past his sister. "No fair, you started first," Sophie protested, quickening her small steps. James Reynolds watched the scene from the living room, lowering his newspaper with a smile. At 5 years old, the twins were a whirlwind of energy and joy, turning every moment into a new adventure. At the table, Sophie spoke excitedly about the treehouse she and Thomas planned to build, gesturing so enthusiastically that she nearly knocked over her juice. Thomas occasionally jumped in to add crucial details, like a drawbridge and a telescope for alien watching. "And can we paint it purple and green?" Sophie asked, her big eyes brimming with hope. "How about we start on the project next weekend?" James winked at Eleanor, who nodded in agreement. "But right now," Eleanor began, exchanging a conspiratorial look with her husband, "your dad and I have a surprise to share." The children instantly stopped eating, their forks suspended in mid-air. "Aunt Sarah is staying with you tonight because—" James paused dramatically. "Your mum and I are going to celebrate our wedding anniversary." "Aunt Sarah!" the twins exclaimed in unison. Their favorite babysitter always brought new games and knew the best bedtime stories. Later, while Elena applied a final touch of lipstick, the twins snuggled on the couch with Sarah, already in their pajamas, ready for story time. "Don't worry, we'll be back before you know it." Elena kissed each of them on the forehead, her soft perfume leaving a comforting trace. "Behave, you two." James ruffled his children's hair. "And don't drive Aunt Sarah crazy." The door closed to the sound of the children's laughter. Outside, dark clouds began gathering on the horizon. Sarah was halfway through a particularly thrilling story about a dragon that collected colorful socks when the first raindrops started tapping on the windows. The wind howled outside, making the trees dance frantically. "Aunt Sarah," Sophie whispered, clutching her stuffed bunny more tightly. "Mum and Dad should be back by now, right?" Thomas pretended not to be worried, but his eyes never left the window. The clock read 11:15 p.m. The doorbell rang at 11:47 p.m. It wasn't the cheerful, familiar ring they knew. It was short, abrupt, official. Sarah opened the door to find 2 police officers, soaked by the rain. Their solemn expressions made her heart tighten. The children, who should have been asleep but were hiding at the top of the stairs, watched in silence. "Mom, we need to talk about James and Elena Reynolds." The rest of the night became a blurred mix of low voices, phone calls, and silent tears. Words like hydroplaning, head-on collision, and instantaneous floated through the air like cruel ghosts. The next morning, Grandma Martha arrived with puffy red eyes. She hugged her grandchildren so tightly it almost hurt, but neither complained. Somehow they knew they needed that hug as much as she did. "Where's Mom?" Sophie asked for the 10th time, her voice small and frightened. "Why haven't she and Dad come back yet?" Martha sat on the couch, pulling the 2 of them closer. How could she explain the inexplicable? How do you tell 2 5-year-olds their parents would never come home again? 3 days later, the sky was impossibly blue for such a dark day. Sophie wore a new black dress that itched around the collar. Thomas kept loosening the bow tie Grandma insisted he wear. They watched, confused, as a crowd of adults wept around 2 shiny wooden boxes. "Why are Mom and Dad sleeping in those boxes?" Thomas asked Sarah, who was holding their little hands tightly. "When are they going to wake up?" Sophie clutched her stuffed bunny to her chest, remembering the scent of her mother on that stormy night. She didn't understand why everyone was so sad, or why people kept saying how sorry they were, or why her grandma couldn't stop crying. But something inside her, something still too young to fully grasp, knew that nothing would ever be the same, that the purple and green treehouse would never be built, that the stories of dragons collecting socks would taste different from now on. When the first shovel of dirt fell onto the boxes, the dull thud echoed like distant thunder. Sophie and Thomas held each other's hands, an instinctive gesture that would become their safe harbor in the years ahead. That night, for the first time, they slept in the same bed too as they used to do during thunderstorms. But now there was no mom to check on them, no dad to chase away imaginary monsters. There was only silence, darkness, and two small hearts beating in sync, trying to make sense of a world that suddenly felt too big. Paul Bennett stared at Manhattan through the glass walls of his penthouse office. Below, the city pulsed with its usual frenetic rhythm, oblivious to the weight of the phone still in his hand. The social worker's voice still echoed in his ears. "I'm sorry to inform you, Mr. Bennett, but your sister Eleanor and her husband—" His sister Elena dead. The 12-year-old whiskey glass trembled slightly in his hand, ice cubes clinking against the crystal. The last time he had seen Eleanor was 5 years ago, at their parents' funeral. They had barely spoken that day. Mr. Bennett, Jessica, his executive assistant, interrupted his thoughts. "The board is waiting for the 2 p.m. meeting." "Cancel everything," he replied, eyes still fixed on the city, "and prepare the private jet. I need to get to Boston today." The reflection in the window showed Jessica hesitating, probably recalculating his meticulously organized schedule in her mind. She knew Paul Bennett never cancelled meetings. Never. "Is something wrong, sir?" Paul closed his eyes, involuntary memories flooding his mind. 15 years ago. "You can't be serious, Elena." Paul stormed across their parents' living room, his voice raised in frustration. "Dropping out of law school in your final year for a history teacher." Elena, her green eyes flashing with determination, faced her older brother. "Your problem, Paul, is thinking money is the only thing that matters in life. No, my problem is having a sister who's throwing her future away. Mom and Dad built all this for us, and they built it for you, Paul. You're the one who always wanted the Bennett empire. I just want to be happy." "Happy?" he laughed bitterly. "How long will that happiness last when you're living in a tiny apartment, counting pennies?" Elena grabbed her purse, tears of rage sliding down her face. "At least I won't die alone in a fancy penthouse." Those were the last words she spoke to him by choice. Present. The private jet soared toward Boston as Paul reviewed documents his lawyer had hastily prepared: a will, death certificates, and custody of the children. The children. He hardly even knew their names. Sophie and Thomas, 5-year-old twins. His niece and nephew, whom he had never met. "There has to be another option," he muttered to himself, loosening his custom-made Italian tie. But there wasn't. The social worker was clear. He was their only living relative. The alternative was the foster care system. His phone vibrated. It was a message from Margaret, his housekeeper of 2 decades. "The rooms are ready, Mr. Bennett. I removed all fragile and valuable objects from the first floor, as requested." Paul almost smiled. Ever efficient, Margaret was likely already rearranging the entire mansion for the arrival of 2 5-year-olds, children, in his immaculate home, with designer furniture, original artwork, and silence. So much silence. The car dropped him off in front of the social services office. The building was grey and dull, so different from the steel and glass skyscrapers he was used to. Inside, the air conditioning struggled against the summer heat. "Mr. Bennett?" A middle-aged woman, grey-haired and kind-looking, greeted him. "I'm Susan Parker. We spoke on the phone." "Please follow me." She led him down a corridor with walls adorned with children's drawings to a small waiting room. Through a glass window, he saw them for the first time. They were so small, so very small. The girl, Sophie, clutched a worn plush bunny, her golden curls identical to Elena's at the same age. The boy tried to look serious, but his lips trembled slightly. Both had their mother's green eyes. "Mr. Bennett," Susan began gently, "I understand this is unexpected for everyone. The children are scared and confused. They lost everything in one night." Paul adjusted his shirt cuffs, an anxious gesture he hadn't done in years. "Miss Parker, I need to be honest. I know nothing about children. My life is complicated. Meetings, travel, obligations. And yet you're here, she noted. Because I'm their only option, he answered, more harshly than he intended. Susan offered a sad smile. No, Mr. Bennett, you're here because, despite everything, you couldn't bear the thought of your niece and nephew in the foster care system. That says something about you, doesn't it? Before he could reply, the door opened and the children entered, guided by another social worker. Up close, the resemblance to Elena was even more painful. Sophie, Thomas, Susan said softly. This is your Uncle Paul, your mum's brother. The twins regarded him with a mixture of curiosity and fear. Paul realized he had been holding his breath. Hi, Thomas spoke first, his small voice steady. Sophie just held her bunny tighter, partially hiding her face behind it. Paul crouched down to their level, not caring about the crease it would make in his Italian trousers. Hello, he said, surprised at the gentleness in his own voice. I'm so sorry about what happened to your parents. The words sounded inadequate, insufficient. How do you console children who've lost everything? How do you replace parents you barely knew? Do you have a big house? Thomas asked suddenly. The question caught Paul off guard. Yes, it's quite big. Is there a yard? Sophie's voice was barely above a whisper. Yes, a very large yard, and there's a pool too. Can Mr. Bunny come? She held up the worn plush toy. Paul felt a tightness in his chest. Of course he can. He's very welcome. As he signed the seemingly endless stack of documents, Paul watched the twins through the office window. They were seated together on a small sofa, Thomas whispering something to his sister that made her give a shy smile. One last signature. Susan slid another paper toward him. It's official. You're now the legal guardian of Sophie and Thomas Reynolds. Paul signed, feeling the weight of that pen more than any multi-million-dollar contract he'd ever handled. Mr. Bennett, Susan called as he was stepping out the door. They're incredible kids, smart, kind, devoted to each other. They just need time and love. Love. Paul wasn't sure he remembered what that felt like anymore. But seeing the twins stand up, hand in hand, ready to follow him into a new life, something inside him, something that had been dormant for a long time, began to stir. On the way to the airport, his phone buzzed incessantly with urgent emails and unanswered messages. For the first time in years, Paul Bennett, CEO of Bennett Enterprises, ignored them completely. He was too busy watching through the rearview mirror, two little faces gazing at the passing city, wearing the weight of a world that had crumbled, but also, perhaps, a faint hope that something new could begin. The wrought iron gate opened silently, revealing a tree-lined driveway. Sophie and Thomas pressed their faces against the car window, eyes wide at the sight of the mansion rising ahead. 3 floors of pale stone with huge windows, imposing and intimidating against the twilight sky. Welcome to your new home, Paul announced, his voice sounding strangely formal even to his own ears. Margaret awaited them at the entrance, her hands clasped over her pristine apron. Behind her stood a row of household staff, lined up like soldiers. The cook, 2 maids, the driver, the gardener. The children must be tired from the trip, Margaret observed, noticing the twins' anxious looks. I've prepared hot chocolate and cookies in their rooms. Excellent, Paul replied, already checking his phone. Show them to their rooms and, well, whatever else they need. I have some important calls to make in the office. Sophie clutched Thomas's hand as they began climbing the marble staircase, their footsteps echoing in the vast entrance hall. The walls were adorned with paintings in gilded frames, seeming to watch them with severe eyes. Your rooms are connected by a door, Margaret explained, opening a white door with gold details. Sophie, this one's yours. The bedroom was large enough to fit her old one 3 times over. The walls were a pale pink, the bed had a silk canopy, and a dollhouse the size of a dining table stood in one corner. And this is yours, Thomas. Margaret opened the adjacent door, revealing a room in shades of blue, with an antique desk, a telescope by the window, and a bookshelf filled with books. Can we sleep in the same room? Sophie asked in a small voice, still holding her plush bunny. Margaret hesitated. Well, each of you has your own room now. Isn't that better? Please, Thomas insisted. Just for tonight. All right, Margaret sighed. Just for tonight. Later, after the children finally fell asleep, together in Sophie's bed, Paul went upstairs to check on them. He stopped in the doorway, observing their sleeping faces. There was something vulnerable in that scene that made him feel uncomfortable, as though intruding on a private moment. The following days established a routine. Paul left early for the office, before the children were even awake. Margaret oversaw breakfast. Private lessons were scheduled to begin the next week, and the house ran like a well-oiled machine. But at night, when silence settled over the mansion, muffled sobs could be heard through the walls. Every morning, Margaret found the twins sleeping together, no matter which room they started in. On the third day, Paul attempted to have dinner with them. "So, how was your day?" he asked, his fork poking at the grilled salmon. "Fine," Thomas answered automatically. Sophie just prodded her peas. "Did you like the new toys?" Another murmured, "Fine." Silence settled over the antique dining table, far too large for just 3 people. Paul checked his watch 5 times before dessert. The next morning, he left a new iPad in each bedroom before heading to work. That night, he found both devices untouched. On Saturday, Paul had no excuse to escape to the office. He wandered through the house like a ghost, occasionally bumping into his nephew and niece, who seemed equally lost in the immense corridors. It was Sophie who found the photo. She was exploring a second-floor room, the one with a piano covered by a white sheet, when she noticed a framed picture on the mantel. In it, a teenage girl smiled while hugging a boy with a serious expression. Her curls were the same golden ones Sophie saw in the mirror. "Uncle Paul," she called, her voice echoing in the empty room. "Is this Mom?" Paul, passing by in the hallway, froze. He approached slowly, as if the photo might bite. "Yes," he answered after a long moment. "She was 16 here. It was her birthday." "She's laughing," Sophie observed, her fingers gently touching the glass. "Yes, she—" Paul cleared his throat. "She had just been given a guitar. She was determined to learn to play it." "Did she learn?" A ghost of a smile crossed Paul's lips. "No, she was terrible. But she kept trying for months, playing the same 3 wrong chords. Like that song Thomas tries to play on his school recorder," Sophie remarked, and for the first time since they arrived, Paul saw her smile. Thomas, who had been listening by the door, entered the room. "I don't play it wrong, I just play differently." "Yes, you do," Sophie laughed. "It sounds like a duck choking." "No, it doesn't." "Yes, it does." Paul watched the exchange between the siblings, feeling something in his chest loosen slightly. "Was there a piano here?" Thomas asked suddenly, noticing the covered instrument. "Yes," Paul answered. "Your mom used to take lessons. She was much better on the piano than the guitar." "Can we see it?" Paul hesitated, then walked to the piano. The white cover slid off like a ghost being banished, revealing the polished mahogany beneath. Sophie approached, cautiously pressing a single key. The solitary note echoed in the room. "Her favorite piece was Claire de Lune," Paul said, surprising himself. "She played it whenever she was nervous or sad." The children looked at him with a newfound curiosity, as if truly seeing him for the first time. "What else did Mom do?" Thomas asked, sitting on the piano bench. Paul sat too, letting Sophie squeeze in between them. "Well," he began, "when she was your age, she used to hide in the library to read. She had a secret corner behind a bookshelf." "Is there a library?" Thomas's eyes lit up. "Can you show us?" Sophie added. Paul automatically glanced at his watch, then stopped. "Sure. Why not?" They spent the afternoon exploring the library. Paul showed them Elena's secret hideout, now too small for adults, but perfect for 2 5-year-olds. They found books with her notes in the margins, an old diary, which Paul discreetly set aside to read later, and even a faded drawing she'd made on the wall behind the shelf. When Margaret called them to dinner, she found the 3 of them sitting on the library floor, surrounded by dusty books and old photos, with Paul recounting the time Eleanor tried to start a secret detective club and ended up discovering the gardener was stealing pears from the orchard. That night, for the first time, Sophie and Thomas slept in their own separate rooms, and for the first time since they arrived, Paul heard no muffled sobs through the walls. Before retiring for the night, he stopped in the piano room. The photo still sat on the mantel, Eleanor, forever 16 and smiling. "I'm sorry," he whispered to her image, "for everything." Then, on a sudden impulse, he uncovered the piano again and pressed one key. The note echoed through the silent mansion, which no longer felt quite so cold. Paul's laptop keys echoed through the library like muffled gunshots. 3 overdue reports, 2 missed video conferences, and now this. Laughter and shouts coming from the hallway, disrupting his concentration for the 5th time that hour. "Margaret!" he called, rubbing his temples. "Margaret!" But it wasn't Margaret who answered. A dull thud followed by childish laughter reverberated through the house, and Paul felt his irritation rise like a wave. The last 2 weeks had been a constant test of his patience, toys scattered in the once spotless corridors, fingerprints smudging the French windows, noise, so much noise. The previous night, he'd found muddy footprints on the 19th century Persian rug. That morning, Thomas had spilled orange juice on important documents. And now, get her, Thomas. No running inside the house. Paul shut his laptop forcefully. His final refuge of peace, the library, was ruined. In the hallway, Sophie and Thomas were playing tag, their laughter echoing like cheerful ghosts in a house that once prized silence. "Children?" His voice came out harsher than he intended. "Didn't we talk about not running indoors?" They stopped abruptly, Sophie almost crashing into her brother. "Sorry, Uncle Paul," Thomas murmured, looking at his own feet. "Sorry doesn't fix," Paul began, but he was interrupted by a sound that froze his blood, the unmistakable tinkle of breaking porcelain. Time seemed to freeze. On the pedestal by the wall, where the Ming Dynasty vase his mother had cherished once stood, there was now only empty space. On the floor, blue and white shards formed a tragic constellation on the Persian rug. "It was an accident," Sophie sobbed, tears already streaming down her face. "We were just playing." Paul felt something inside him snap, like a dam finally giving way. The frustration of the past few weeks burst forth. "An accident!" His voice rose dangerously. "Knocking over a glass of water is an accident. This," he pointed to the shards, "this is destruction. That piece was 400 years old. It was a family heirloom." Thomas stepped forward, positioning himself partly in front of his sister. "We can fix it." "Fix it?" Paul let out a humorless laugh. "You can't fix anything. All you do is destroy. Ever since you arrived, it's been one thing after another. This house was perfect before you." Sophie was openly weeping now, clinging to her brother's arm. Thomas's eyes were brimming with tears, but he kept his chin up, his gaze a mix of fear and defiance. "I can't take this anymore," Paul continued, his voice echoing through the corridors. "Why can't you just disappear, go away? Never come back?" The silence that followed was deafening. Paul saw it as if in slow motion, the exact moment something broke in the children's eyes, something far more valuable than any vase. Sophie was the first to run, Thomas right behind her. The sound of their footsteps on the stairs dwindled until it was swallowed by the mansion's sepulchral hush. Paul stood there, breathing heavily, the vase fragments at his feet reflecting the afternoon light like frozen tears. "Sir?" Margaret appeared, her usually composed face lined with worry. "I heard shouting." "Clean up this mess," he ordered coldly, turning back toward the library. "Mr. Bennet," Margaret said, her tone sharper than he'd ever heard from her in 20 years. "They're children who have lost everything." Paul didn't reply. He locked himself in the library, trying to return to work, but the words on the screen danced meaninglessly. The sky darkened slowly, heavy clouds promising rain. Dinner was served, but the children's seats remained empty. Margaret reported they wouldn't leave their rooms. "Maybe you should," she began. "They need to learn," Paul cut her off, though he hadn't touched the food on his plate either. At midnight, the storm broke. Paul was still in his office, half a glass of whiskey on his desk, when Margaret burst through the door without knocking, something she had never done before. "They're gone." "What do you mean, gone?" "I went to bring them hot chocolate. Their rooms are empty. The beds weren't even slept in. And," She held out a crumpled piece of paper. "I found this." The childish, uneven handwriting said only, "Since you want us gone, goodbye." Paul felt the ground vanish beneath his feet. Outside, thunder shook the mansion's windows, and rain fell in dense sheets. "I've already called the police," Margaret said, wringing her apron in her hands. "They're on their way." Paul walked to the window, staring into the darkness beyond the glass. Somewhere out there, 2 5-year-olds were wandering alone in a storm, because of him. Elena's voice echoed in his mind. "At least I won't die alone in a fancy penthouse." No, she had died, leaving 2 children, his niece and nephew, in the care of a brother she knew to be too cold, too busy, too concerned with things that now seemed absurdly insignificant. "Sir?" Margaret was still at the door. "What should we do?" Paul glanced at the vase shards on his desk. Margaret had gathered them carefully. "A family heirloom," he'd said. But what family was left to preserve any heirlooms? "Get the car," he ordered, already grabbing his coat. "And umbrellas." Lots of umbrellas. As he dashed down the stairs, Paul realized that, for the first time since the children arrived, he wasn't thinking about missed meetings, late reports, or broken porcelains. He was thinking only of 2 small figures lost in the night, carrying nothing but broken hearts and a soaked stuffed bunny. And finally, he was feeling fear. Not the calculated fear of business, but the visceral, primal terror of realizing too late that some things, once broken, can't be fixed with all the money in the world. The rain turned the city lights into blurry colors as Sophie and Thomas walked hand in hand along the slippery sidewalk. Mr. Bunny, now drenched, dangled limply from Sophie's free hand. "I'm cold," Sophie whispered, her teeth chattering. Thomas squeezed his sister's hand. "There," he pointed to a bus shelter with a roof. "We can wait for the rain to stop." Huddled on the metal bench, the twins watched cars pass by, their headlights reflecting in puddles like aquatic fireflies. Neither mentioned the hunger gnawing at their stomachs. "Do you think he'll miss us?" Sophie asked after a long silence. Thomas didn't answer right away. "He wanted us gone," he finally said. The night wore on slowly. When the rain finally eased, they resumed their aimless walk, guided only by the need to keep moving to ward off the cold. The park appeared like an oasis in the urban landscape. In the empty, rain-soaked playground, they found a plastic tunnel, part of a play structure, that offered some shelter. "Come here, kiddos," a raspy voice startled them. An elderly woman emerged from the shadows, carrying a worn backpack. Her wrinkled face had a kindness that faintly reminded them of Grandma Martha. "I'll catch pneumonia like that," she said, pulling out a thin blanket from her bag. "They call me Rose. I've got a little drier spot under the bridge." Thomas hesitated, stepping protectively in front of his sister. "Our mom said not to talk to strangers." Rose gave a sad smile. "Your mom's right, but I bet she also wouldn't want you freezing in a playground. I have hot chocolate in a thermos." The camp under the bridge was a small world apart. Stretched tarps formed makeshift tents, and a few people sat around a small fire contained in a metal barrel. "Hey, Rose, who are the little ones?" asked a man with a gray beard. "Found them soaked in the playground, Joe." "They need to dry off." Joe and the others, 3 more people, kept a respectful distance while Rose wrapped the twins in the blanket and offered them paper cups of hot chocolate. "You don't have to tell us anything you don't want to," she said gently. "But is anyone looking for you?" Sophie and Thomas exchanged looks. "Our uncle," Sophie started. "He doesn't want us," Thomas finished. Back at the Bennett mansion, Paul paced his office while the police took statements. "Was there a disagreement before they disappeared?" a detective asked. Notebook open, Paul straightened his tie. "A small reprimand about proper behavior." "What kind of reprimand, Mr. Bennett?" Before he could respond, the doorbell rang. Margaret returned moments later, accompanied by a woman in a grey blazer and a determined expression. "Claire Peterson, Social Services," she introduced herself. "I was notified about Sophie and Thomas Reynolds' disappearance." "We're already handling it," Paul replied curtly. "Yes, I see." Claire glanced around the luxurious office. "Any specific reason 2 5-year-olds would run away from a mansion?" Paul felt his face grow hot. "There was an incident." "What incident?" "They broke a valuable vase. I might have lost my temper." Claire jotted something in her file. And exactly what did you say to them, Mr. Bennet? Morning brought a harsh clarity. Sophie and Thomas, now less soaked but still exhausted, shared a piece of bread Rose had given them. We need to go, Thomas whispered to his sister, before someone makes us go back. But where? Sophie asked. The question remained unanswered. Seizing a moment when Rose was distributing coffee to the others, the twins slipped away quietly. Downtown was waking up. Rushed professionals strode past them without a second glance. A woman dragging a rolling suitcase nearly tripped over Sophie. "Where do you think you're going?" A gruff voice made them freeze. A mall security guard eyed them suspiciously. "Where are your parents?" The twins bolted, their small hearts pounding like drums. They darted into one alley, then another, until they were completely lost. "Thomas," Sophie whimpered, "I want to go home." "Which home?" he replied, sounding far more bitter than a 5-year-old should be able to. Claire Peterson parked in a residential neighborhood, watching children play in a nearby yard. Not Sophie and Thomas, but they could have been. Her mind kept calculating how long 2 small kids could survive alone on the streets. Her phone rang. "Missy Peterson, it's Margaret from the Bennet mansion. I thought you should know. I found something in the kids' room." "What exactly?" "A journal. Sophie was writing in it. There's an address marked several times. Looks like their old home." Claire was already starting the car. "Send me the address." As she drove, she couldn't stop thinking about the distant look in Paul Bennett's eyes when he spoke of his niece and nephew, like they were an inconvenience in his perfectly organized life, rather than 2 traumatized children desperately needing love. The sun was beginning to set when Sophie and Thomas finally recognized where they were. The street looked familiar, though now it seemed different, smaller, sadder. Their old house stood empty, a for sale sign in the front window. The swing their dad built still hung from the backyard tree, creaking softly in the evening breeze. "Look," Thomas pointed to a second-floor window. "Our room." Sophie clutched Mr. Bunny more tightly. "I wish Mom and Dad were here." Thomas took her hand. He was about to reply when headlights lit up the quiet street. A car pulled over, and a woman stepped out hurriedly. "Sophie? Thomas?" Claire called gently. "It's all right. No one will hurt you." The twins looked at each other, too tired to run anymore. "For you must be hungry," Claire continued, keeping her distance. "How about a burger? I know a great place nearby." Sophie took a step forward. "We don't have to go back to the mansion," Claire smiled kindly. "Not today. Today we'll just get a warm meal and talk a bit. How does that sound?" Thomas still hesitated. "Promise?" "I promise." Slowly, like frightened kittens, the twins approached. Claire noted their tangled hair, dirty clothes, and exhausted eyes, but she also saw something else, a surprising resilience in 2 children who, having lost everything, still had each other. Guiding them toward her car, Claire was already mentally outlining her report. Paul Bennet had a lot to explain, and this time, all his money and influence wouldn't be enough to escape the consequences of his actions. St. Francis' home was a red brick building surrounded by a well-kept garden. Claire led the twins along the stone path, watching how they clung close to each other, Sophie still clutching her soaked, stuffed bunny. "Welcome," a kindly-faced nun greeted them at the door. "I'm Sister Maria. You 2 must be exhausted." The children took in the surroundings, colorful walls adorned with children's drawings, the distant sound of laughter coming from somewhere inside, the smell of freshly baked cookies in the air. "Come," Sister Maria held out her hand. "Let's find you some dry clothes." Thomas hesitated. "Can we stay in the same room? We have separate dormitories for boys and girls," the nun explained gently. "But you'll see each other all day long." Sophie squeezed her brother's hand. "Promise." "I promise." In the following weeks, the twins slowly adapted to life at the shelter. Mornings were for lessons, afternoons for recreation. Sophie discovered the art room, where she spent hours drawing with crayons and watercolors. Thomas fell in love with the small library, devouring astronomy books and building paper rockets. "Look at this," Claire remarked to Sister Maria, admiring one of Sophie's drawings. It was a detailed portrait of their old house, each window and flower meticulously sketched. "She has a special gift," the nun agreed, And Thomas, well, his math teacher says he's solving problems 2 years above his level. In the girls' dorm, Sophie befriended Lucy, a 7-year-old who also had a stuffed toy, a penguin named Sir Waddles. In the boys' dorm, Thomas found an ally in Miguel, who shared his passion for building things out of recycled materials. Every morning before classes, the twins met in the garden. It was their special time when they could just be Sophie and Thomas, whispering to each other about their fears and dreams. "I made this for you," Sophie said one morning, giving her brother a drawing. It was a portrait of him peering through a telescope, stars shining in the background. "It's perfect," Thomas smiled, carefully tucking the drawing into his science notebook. "When I build a real rocket, you'll do all the designs." In Claire's office, a folder grew thicker with reports and observations. The children were doing well, but something nagged at her. Why had Paul Bennett, with all his resources, simply given up on his niece and nephew without a fight? "Mr. Bennett," she said over the phone, "we need to discuss Sophie and Thomas." "They're safe, aren't they?" His voice sounded distant, professional. "That home has a good reputation." "That's not the point. You're their legal guardian. And I'm clearly unfit for the role. I'd rather not interfere any further." Claire frowned. There was something in his voice, not just coldness, but perhaps guilt. Her investigation led her to old family files. Faded photographs showed a young Elena and Paul smiling. Newspaper clippings documented the meteoric rise of Bennett Enterprises. Then silence, years without any record of the siblings' contact. Life went on at the shelter. Sophie discovered a special talent for portraits, capturing not just facial features, but something of the spirit of her subjects. Her paintings began decorating St. Francis Home's corridors. Meanwhile, Thomas astounded everyone by winning the school science fair with a project on solar energy. His prize, a small, fully functional telescope, became the centerpiece of nightly observation sessions he organized for the other kids in the garden. "See that star?" he'd explain, adjusting the telescope. "It's part of the Orion constellation." "It looks magical," Lucy whispered, peering through the lens. Sophie, sitting on the grass beside her brother, sketched the moment in a new notebook, a gift from Claire. On the page, the kids became tiny astronomers uncovering the universe's secrets. But it wasn't all stars and paintings. At night, when the dorms fell silent, there were still tears. Sophie still woke up calling for her mum. Thomas still had nightmares about the stormy night they ran away. "Why didn't he want us?" Sophie asked one afternoon as she painted in the art room. Claire, visiting, felt her heart clench. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes," she replied, watching the girl add dark shadows to her canvas. A lonely mansion under a stormy sky. "But that doesn't mean you did anything wrong." Thomas, reading by the window, glanced up from his book. "We don't need him. We have each other." Claire noticed the silent exchange between the twins, a form of communication built through a lifetime of shared joys and sorrows. They were stronger together, that much was clear. She also saw how Thomas instinctively protected his sister, how Sophie always saved an extra piece of dessert for him. They were only children, yet they had already learned to be a family to each other in a way Paul Bennett, for all his wealth, seemed unable to comprehend. That night, after all the children were asleep, Claire sat in her office reviewing her notes. Old Bennett family photos lay scattered on her desk, frozen moments from a happier past. Something there, an untold story, needed to be unearthed, not just for Sophie and Thomas's sake, but for Paul's as well. Because in the few moments she'd seen him with the kids, Claire sensed something he himself might not realize, a suppressed desire for connection, stifled by years of emotional distance. Among her papers lay a new drawing by Sophie. It showed 3 figures holding hands, Sophie, Thomas, and a golden-haired woman smiling gently. In the corner, in careful childish handwriting, were the words, "Our family in heaven." Claire picked up her phone. It was time for another talk with Paul Bennett. Time at St. Francis Home flowed like a gentle river, marked by seasons and small victories. In their first spring, the school auditorium erupted in applause when Sophie went on stage to receive her first art award. Her drawing, a self-portrait of her and Thomas gazing at the stars, won the regional competition. In the front row, Thomas clapped louder than everyone. while Claire smiled proudly, camera in hand. In the back row, unnoticed by anyone, a man in an expensive suit watched briefly before slipping out quietly. As summers passed, Thomas's talent with computers became evident. In the computer lab, his fingers flew over the keyboard with surgical precision. "That's impossible," Miguel complained, looking at the screen. "How do you solve these problems so fast?" Thomas shrugged, immersed in lines of code. "It's just logic, like putting a puzzle together." The computer teacher created a coding club just for him, nurturing his exceptional skills. Sophie often dropped by after class, with her now more sophisticated sketchbook. "Check this out." She'd show him her creations, characters for the games he developed, interfaces that made his code more user-friendly. Autumn brought exhibitions and competitions. Claire parked in front of the Modern Art Museum, where a banner announced the young artist's exhibit. Near the entrance, Sophie's art, now sophisticated digital paintings, was displayed prominently. "Nervous?" Claire asked the young artist, who was fiddling anxiously with her dress. "A little," Sophie admitted. "But Thomas said he'd hack the voting system if I don't win." "I didn't say that," Thomas protested, adjusting an uncomfortable bow tie. "I just said I could." Winter saw the twins change. Sophie, once shy, now faced crowds gracefully. Thomas channeled his pain into a fierce determination to master every tech challenge he encountered. The state computer science competition marked another turning point. Thomas, the youngest participant, presented software that translated art into music, inspired by Sophie's paintings. "The algorithm analyzes colors, shapes, and strokes," he explained to the judges, "and converts them into melodies and harmonies." When he won first place, Sophie was the first to hug him. "I knew you could do it." In the back of the auditorium, Paul Bennett watched the presentation via tablet, live-streamed by a staff member he regularly sent to keep tabs on the twins. The seasons kept turning. Sophie began work on her most ambitious art series, Echoes of Silence. "Are you sure about this?" Claire asked, watching her paint. "Absolutely," Sophie replied, her brushes dancing across the canvas. "I want to tell our story." The exhibit opened in a small local gallery. 12 paintings depicted the twins' journey, from a happy home to a cold mansion, from dark streets to a welcoming shelter. The final painting showed 2 trees growing side by side, their roots intertwined, reaching for the sky. Thomas spent hours studying each piece. "You did it," he said softly. "You showed everything we couldn't say." The computer lab at the shelter evolved over the years. New machines, donated anonymously, allowed Thomas to teach programming to younger kids. "Who do you think sent them?" Lucy asked one day. Sophie and Thomas exchanged looks. They knew the anonymous donor was the same one who quietly funded their extra lessons, art supplies, and competition fees. The same person who never appeared, never spoke, never reached out. "It doesn't matter," Thomas said, turning back to his code. "What matters is what we do with it." The final winter at the shelter brought the letters that would change everything. "MIT," Claire read aloud, her voice trembling with excitement. "Thomas, that's incredible." "And Parsons for me," Sophie announced, holding up her own acceptance letter. "New York City." Top schools in their respective fields, offering full scholarships, not from an anonymous donor this time, but earned through their own merits. "They're in different cities," Lucy said worriedly. The twins smiled. For once, they didn't look afraid of separation. "We already talked about it," Sophie explained. "It's time to find out who we are individually." "Besides," Thomas added, "Boston to New York is only a 4-hour train ride." That night, in the shelter garden, the twins settled into their favorite spot under the stars. The same telescope from their first science fair pointed toward Orion. "Remember when you said you'd build a rocket?" Sophie smiled. "And you said you'd do the drawings," Thomas finished. "I guess we got close, huh?" Sophie flipped through her sketchbook. Not the same one, but in spirit identical to the one she carried when they arrived at the shelter. Inside were years of dreams, fears, and hopes, rendered in increasingly confident strokes. "Do you think they'd be proud?" she asked, looking up at the sky. Thomas followed her gaze. "I'm sure they would." In his Manhattan office, Paul Bennett studied the scanned acceptance letters on his tablet. Alongside them, a folder contained years of reports, photos and newspaper clippings about art exhibits and coding competitions. "They did it, Elena," he murmured to his sister's photo on his desk. "In spite of me, not because of me, they did it." His phone buzzed. It was Claire Peterson. "They're ready," she said simply. "The question is, are you?" The Parsons fashion show was packed. Backstage, Sophie checked the final details of her digital connections collection. Each piece incorporated subtle technology, dresses that changed color with the wearer's mood, blazers with built-in music controls in the sleeves, scarves displaying personalized messages. "All sensors are working perfectly," Thomas confirmed, scanning a tablet. Though he was studying at MIT, he insisted on being there to program every interactive element of his sister's designs. The applause was thunderous as the models walked the runway. In the front row, Claire discreetly wiped away tears of pride. Farther back in the audience, unnoticed by anyone, Paul Bennett watched his niece shine. The success was instantaneous. Fashion and tech magazines clamored for interviews with the young designer revolutionizing wearable tech. But Sophie had bigger plans. "I don't just want to make beautiful clothes," she explained to Thomas during a weekend meetup in New Haven, halfway between their universities. "I want pieces that truly impact people's lives." Thomas smiled, turning his laptop so she could see the screen. "Then you'll like this. Remember that accessibility app I was working on?" On the display was a sleek interface for a system that translated body movements into commands, letting people with limited mobility control devices with minimal gestures. "With your textile tech," he went on, "we could integrate this into clothing. Imagine jackets that help people with paralysis move more independently." Sophie grabbed her ever-present sketchbook, still a staple in her life, and started sketching. What if we added sensors here and here? Textile was born at that cafe table, scribbled on napkins and fueled by ambitious dreams. The first office was small, a shared space in Brooklyn. Sophie turned one corner into a studio, with mannequins and scraps of tech fabric scattered among computers and circuit boards. "It's more organized than my room at the shelter," she joked, hanging on the wall her first drawing of Thomas with his telescope. The first few months were a roller coaster. Investors loved the concept but questioned the founder's youth. Manufacturers doubted large-scale production feasibility. "Maybe we should start smaller," Thomas suggested after another frustrating meeting. "No," Sophie replied with the same determination that had kept them alive all those years. "We do it our way." Their breakthrough came with the launch of their first prototype, an adaptive clothing line for children with disabilities. A video showing a 6-year-old moving her arms for the first time thanks to a textile jacket went viral. Investors started calling. Headlines multiplied. Prodigy siblings revolutionize adaptive fashion. Textile, where fashion meets purpose. The new geniuses of wearable technology. "Have you seen this?" Thomas showed Sophie a Forbes article. "We're on their 30 under 30 list." Sophie barely looked up from her new project, a dress aiding people with social anxiety, providing gentle tactile feedback in stressful situations. "Cool," she muttered, adjusting a sensor. "But look, I managed to cut energy usage by 40%. Success brought new challenges. Major tech companies wanted to buy textile for astronomical sums. Luxury brands demanded exclusive collaborations. "We're not selling," the twins would say in unison whenever the topic arose. Claire visited often, bringing homemade cookies from St. Francis and news of the kids who now dreamed of being like the Reynolds twins. "Lucy is studying fashion design," she said during one visit. "Miguel got into an engineering program." "You inspired a whole generation at the shelter." In his office at Bennett Enterprises, Paul tracked every one of his niece and nephew's achievements through newspaper clippings and reports. One file on his computer contained every article, every photo, every milestone. Textile grew fast. They moved into an entire floor of a commercial building. The team expanded, but the heart of the company remained the space where Sophie and Thomas worked side by side, merging art and technology as they had since they were kids. "Remember when you hacked the shelter's light system for my birthday light show?" Sophie asked one late night, working overtime. "And you designed such a pretty instruction manual that Sister Maria framed it," Thomas laughed. I guess we always knew what we wanted to do. Their biggest test came when they were invited to a major tech conference. In the audience, unnoticed by them, sat Paul Bennett. Sophie took the stage first, dazzling in one of her own designs, a dress that responded to brain waves. Technology shouldn't just be useful, she declared. It should be beautiful, inclusive, and transformative. Thomas followed, explaining the technical aspects with the same passion he'd shown teaching programming at the shelter. Every line of code, every stitch of fabric has a purpose, to give voice and movement to those who need it. The applause was deafening. Exiting, Paul overheard two executives chatting. Amazing how two people this young achieved so much, and they did it all on their own. It's inspiring. Paul felt the weight of those words, on their own. Not entirely. Claire, the shelter, everyone who believed in them had helped. But he, who should have been their rock, was just a distant shadow in their lives. That night, in his office, he opened the latest edition of Time. On the cover, Sophie and Thomas smiled side by side under the headline, "The Siblings Redefining the Future." His phone rang. Claire, once again. "They don't need you anymore," she said bluntly. "But maybe you need them." Paul stared at the magazine cover for a long time. In his niece and nephew's smiles, he saw the same sparkle Elena had when she talked about her dreams. Dreams he had once deemed foolish and impractical. It was time to make amends. The headquarters of Textile now occupied an entire building in the heart of Manhattan. From the rooftop garden, Sophie looked out at the city while adjusting final details on a prototype. A gala dress that responded to brainwaves to help people with social anxiety at big events. "Sensors are detecting microfacial expressions now," Thomas explained, showing real-time data on his tablet. "The AI can predict anxiety signals before the person even realizes it." "Perfect for next week's launch," Sophie smiled, admiring how the fabric shifted color subtly, creating calming patterns. The Wall Street Journal had just published a lengthy feature on them. Textile, how two siblings are revolutionizing the fashion industry. The company had become a global sensation, with branches in London, Tokyo, and Sao Paulo. "Miss Reynolds," her assistant interrupted. "Vogue is on the line. They want to confirm the interview for the September cover." Sophie nodded, still focused on the dress. Publicity wasn't her main priority, never had been. Her obsession was creating garments that truly made a difference. On the development floor, Thomas led a team of programmers. Screens displayed simulations of their latest innovation, smart fabrics that adapted not just to weather, but to the wearer's medical needs. "The algorithm constantly monitors vital signs," he explained to an impressed group of investors. "If it detects any anomaly, the clothing can administer medication through micropores or alert emergency services." What started as a small adaptive clothing startup had grown to disrupt multiple industries: healthcare, sports, security. Textiles stock soared, and acquisition offers flooded in weekly. "Another offer from Google," Thomas commented over lunch with his sister on the rooftop cafe. $3 billion this time." Sophie toyed with her salad absently. "They just don't get it, do they? It's never been about the money." "Never," he agreed. "It's about making the difference no one made for us." At that hour, the cafe was quiet, except for an older man reading a newspaper at a nearby table. Something about him seemed vaguely familiar. "Excuse me," the man approached them suddenly. "You probably don't remember me. I'm James. I was the driver at the Bennett mansion." The twins froze. That part of their lives felt like it belonged to someone else. "Of course," Sophie replied politely. "You used to leave chocolate on the back seat for us." James smiled, touched that she remembered. "I work for a transport company now, smaller, but mine. Mr. Bennett helped me start it, you know." After you left." Thomas frowned. "Paul Bennett helped you?" "Oh, yes. He changed a lot after that night. He began a program to help employees who wanted to launch their own businesses. Margaret, the housekeeper, has a small inn in Vermont now." Sophie and Thomas exchanged glances. This was a side of their uncle they had never imagined. "He follows your successes, you know," James went on. "Keeps every article, every story. On Elena's, your mom's birthday, I always see him at the cemetery. He talks about you. A heavy silence fell over the table. Years of hurt and resentment suddenly gained a new, not necessarily simpler, perspective. Back at the office, work went on. Sophie presented her new collection to executives from major sports brands, apparel that not only improved performance, but helped prevent injuries. The fabric detects muscle fatigue, she explained, demonstrating how the fibers auto-adjusted. And Thomas's AI analyzes movement patterns to suggest real-time corrections. But her thoughts kept drifting back to the encounter with James. On her office wall hung one of her earliest drawings from the shelter years, the Bennett mansion in the rain, dark and frightening. She kept it as a reminder of where they came from, of what they overcame. In his office, Thomas sifted through old news reports about Bennett Enterprises. He found social responsibility programs started soon after they left, significant donations to children's shelters, scholarship funds. "Why didn't we know about this?" he muttered, matching the dates to his own memories. A notification popped up on his screen, another acquisition offer, this time from Asia's largest tech conglomerate. The sum was staggering. "Don't bother answering," Sophie said, walking in. "I just turned down the same offer." Thomas spun his chair around. "I found something interesting. Remember how we used to get anonymous donations at the shelter? Her new equipment and art supplies. You think? I'm almost sure. And there's more. That scholarship you got for the summer course in Paris, the sponsor was a Bennett Enterprises subsidiary." Sophie sat down heavily. "Why would he do it secretly? Why not talk to us directly?" Thomas finished. "Maybe for the same reason we keep that photo of him and Mom hidden in the drawer." True enough. They each kept the same photo, Paul and Elena as teenagers, smiling in some distant summer. They never spoke about it, but they never got rid of it either. The day ended with a video call to European investors. Textile was about to launch its most ambitious line yet. Clothing that not only assisted people with disabilities, but redefined their interaction with the world. "This is our most important project," Sophie told the team. "And the most personal," Thomas added, remembering the kids at the shelter who had inspired them. Later, alone on the rooftop, the twins gazed at the city lights. New York at night reminded Thomas of the integrated circuits he loved so much, lines of illumination connecting brilliant points, forming something greater than the sum of its parts. "Sometimes I wonder," Sophie said softly, "if Mom would be proud, not just of our success but of who we've become." Thomas took her hand, like he'd done countless times since they were children. "I think so, but there's someone else who needs to know it too." Sophie looked toward the Bennett Enterprises building, visible in the distance. "I'm still not sure I'm ready." "Me neither," Thomas admitted. "But maybe it's time we learn the rest of the story." Sophie's phone buzzed in her pocket, a message from Claire. "You need to see this." Attached was a link to a recent interview with Paul Bennett. The last question was about his greatest regret. His answer was simple: not being the uncle two extraordinary children deserved. The computer screen lit Thomas's face as he pored over old Bennett Enterprises documents. Textile's expansion required thorough market research, even looking into potential partners and competitors. That's when he found something unusual, an obscure subsidiary called Reynolds Trust Holdings. "Sophie," he called, tension in his voice. "I need you to see this." She walked over from her desk, leaning in. Documents on his monitor showed regular transfers to an offshore account, starting right after their parents' deaths. "What is this?" Sophie asked, squinting at the screen. "Our trust fund," Thomas replied bitterly, "or the one we should have had." More research revealed a shocking truth. Their parents had set up a substantial trust for them, managed by Bennett Enterprises. Paul, as executor, had full control until they came of age. "He hid this from us," Sophie whispered, her face pale. All this time, Thomas dug deeper, his expression growing darker with every discovery. "It wasn't just the money, Sophie. There were letters, specific instructions from our parents about how they wanted us raised. And he ignored them," Sophie said, her voice trembling with anger. "Dumped us in a shelter when we had a fund that could have given us a completely different life," Thomas concluded, slamming the laptop shut. Sophie walked to the window, looking out over the city. The empire they'd built with so much effort now had a bitter taste. "What do we do with this information?" she finally asked. Thomas joined her. Across the street, the Bennett Enterprises building loomed against the Manhattan skyline. "Legally, we can sue," he said. "The statute of limitations for fiduciary fraud hasn't expired." Sophie unlocked her phone, scrolling to a photo James had shared weeks earlier, Paul and Elena, younger, smiling together. "It's not about the money," she said slowly. "It never was." "No," Thomas agreed. "It's about the truth. It's about justice." In the following days, the twins worked methodically. They hired the best inheritance law firm in New York. Private investigators were assigned to trace every cent of the trust fund. "Ms. Reynolds, Mr. Reynolds," their lead attorney, Diana Chen, greeted them in her luxurious office. "The documents you've provided are, well, they're a powder keg." She spread files across her mahogany desk. "Paul Bennett didn't just conceal the trust's existence, he actively kept you away from it. For instance, the shelter paperwork was manipulated to suggest you had no resources. And the anonymous donations?" Sophie asked. "The computers, the art supplies." "Crumbs," Diana replied, pointing to more documents. "Insignificant compared to the trust's total value, possibly a way to ease his own conscience." Thomas, who had been silent, spoke up. "We want to do this the right way. It's not about vengeance, it's acknowledgement," Sophie finished. "We want him to admit what he did and face the consequences." Diana nodded in understanding. "I suggest a two-pronged approach. First, we gather the airtight case. Then, we offer him a chance to settle before going public." "He'll try to buy our silence," Thomas predicted. "Most likely," Diana agreed. "Bennett Enterprises' reputation is on the line. A scandal of this magnitude." "We don't want to destroy the company," Sophie interjected. "There are innocent people depending on it, like James, like Margaret." The investigators brought more findings in the following days. A pattern emerged. Every time the twins reached a milestone, school admission, competitions, graduations, small amounts were released from the trust, always anonymously. "Like breadcrumbs," Thomas observed bitterly, sorting through the data, "feeding us with our own money." Sophie spent hours in her studio, channeling her anger into new designs. Her latest pieces had an edge that hadn't been there before, bolder colors, sharper lines. "Are you okay?" Claire asked on a visit, noticing the change. Sophie hesitated, then showed her the legal documents. Claire was silent for a long time. "I should have investigated more," she finally said. "When he just gave up custody, I should have dug deeper." "It's not your fault," Thomas assured her. "He fooled everyone." Preparation for the showdown took weeks. Each document was triple-checked, every transaction tracked. Diana built an unassailable case. "We're ready," she announced at a final meeting. "I can arrange a meeting with Paul Bennett whenever you want." The twins exchanged glances. Years of repressed emotion, anger, pain, confusion, solidified in that moment. "Do it," Sophie said firmly. Thomas placed his hand over hers on the table. Together, like always. That night, alone in Textile's office, they looked out at the city that now belonged to them as much as it did to Paul Bennett. "You know what's ironic," Sophie said softly. "If he'd been honest from the start, if he'd used the trust the way our parents wanted, we might have become exactly who he feared," Thomas finished. "Privileged, dependent. Instead, we became who we are." He gestured to the empire they built. "Maybe we should thank him." Sophie gave a wry smile. "Let's hold off on the thank you until after we confront him." Her phone rang on the desk. Diana again. "I got it arranged," she said. "Paul Bennett agreed to see us tomorrow at 10 a.m. After hanging up, the twins remained in silence, watching the city lights. Somewhere out there, in his luxury penthouse, Paul Bennett was likely unaware of the storm heading his way. "For Mom and Dad," Sophie whispered. "For us," Thomas added. In the end, truth was the only inheritance that truly mattered. The makeshift war room on Textile's top floor resembled a military command center. Screens covered the walls, showing graphs, timelines, and documents. On the conference table lay papers, laptops, and half-empty coffee cups. "We found something interesting," said Marcus Chen, the lead investigator, pointing to a screen. Her series of suspicious transfers starting 3 months before the accident. Thomas leaned over his laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard, while Sophie took rapid notes on her tablet. "Look at this," Thomas murmured. "These transfers, they weren't initiated by Paul, they were initiated by our parents." Diana Chen, the attorney, joined them. "That significantly changes the narrative." Sophie frowned, scanning the numbers. "Why would they be moving so much money so fast? And why to accounts in the Caymans?" Thomas added. They dug deeper. The team worked tirelessly, peeling away layers of complex financial dealings. Each discovery raised more questions. "Records show your parents took out huge loans in the months before the accident," explained Sarah Winters, the financial analyst. "They practically mortgaged everything they had." "But why?" Sophie pressed. Weren't we well off?" "Apparently," Thomas answered, still typing, "not as much as we thought." The morning of the confrontation arrived beneath a sky heavy with dark clouds. Sophie adjusted her blazer, her own design, discreetly fitted with sensors that monitored her vitals. Thomas checked his custom smartwatch, which would record every word. "Remember," Diana advised as they walked to their limo, "the evidence is on our side." Bennett Mansion looked bigger and more intimidating. Their memories. The driver opened the door,
And the twins stepped out in perfect...
Margaret, still the housekeeper after all these years, received them at the door. Her face showed both shock and subdued joy. "Mr. Bennett is waiting in the office," she said quietly. The hallway seemed endless. The same paintings adorned the walls, including the empty space where the Ming vase once stood. Sophie felt Thomas gently squeeze her hand, a gesture of comfort they had shared since childhood. Paul Bennett stood by the window when they entered. He turned slowly, and for a moment, no one spoke. Time had added more silver to his hair, more lines to his face. "Sophie, Thomas." His voice was rougher than they remembered. "Welcome home." "Spare us the pleasantries," Thomas began, but Sophie lifted a hand to quiet him. "We want answers," she said simply, placing a folder on the mahogany desk. Paul looked at the folder a long moment. "I assume you've learned about the trust." "Not just the trust," Thomas said, stepping forward. "The transfers, the offshore accounts, all of it. Then you only know half the story," Paul replied, sitting heavily in his chair. Sophie tilted her head. "What's the other half?" Paul opened a drawer, pulling out an old, yellowed file. "This," he said, "is what your parents never wanted you to know. What I've been protecting you from for 16 years. He spread the documents on the desk. Financial statements, foreclosure notices, collection letters. "Your parents," Paul began, his voice laden with exhaustion, "made a catastrophic investment 6 months before the accident. They put everything they had into a scheme that turned out to be a massive fraud." Thomas picked up one of the papers, skimming the numbers. "This can't be right." "Elena was always an idealist," Paul said. "James, your father, believed the wrong people. When they found out they'd been scammed, they tried to recoup it through risky loans, desperate bets in volatile markets." Sophie sank into a chair, her legs suddenly weak. "The trust was a shell," Paul finished. "Empty. The money that was supposed to be in there was already gone. Your parents were essentially bankrupt when they died." "Why hide it?" Thomas demanded. "Why make us think you were the villain?" Paul stood, walking to a painting on the wall, Eleanor, at a younger age. Lightning lit his tired features. "Because sometimes it's easier to hate someone than to accept the people you love can make devastating mistakes." 10 years earlier, remembered watching from a distance as Sophie won her first art contest, the prize money secretly arranged by him, as were the donated art supplies at the shelter. That same month, another debt notice arrived, another of the twins' parents' debts he quietly paid, hoping to protect the family name. "Sir," his accountant had warned, "we can't keep covering these debts indefinitely." "Find a way," Paul had ordered. "There's always a way." Present, "Every cent I salvaged went to you," Paul continued. "Through anonymous donations, scholarships, equipment." "Breadcrumbs," Thomas interjected bitterly. "All I could do without alerting creditors," Paul corrected, "if they sensed new money." They'd come after us, Sophie realized. Finally understanding, silence hung over them. Thomas kept studying the documents, his analytical mind trying to piece everything together. Sophie gazed at the garden where she and Thomas had once played. "I can prove all of it," Paul added gently. "Every transaction, every desperate attempt they made to fix things. And every bit of money I recovered for you over the years." Diana, who had been quietly observing, spoke. "That explains the inconsistencies we found, the transfer patterns, the attempts at concealment." "It wasn't to protect me," Paul said. "It was to protect Elena's memory, to give you a chance to grow up without that burden." Sophie turned from the window, tears glistening. All this time, Paul echoed, "you built something extraordinary, something your parents would have loved to see, something you built with your own hands, not with a tarnished inheritance." Thomas stood, walking over to Sophie. As always, they faced life together. "We need time," Sophie said. "Time to process all of this." Paul nodded. "You have all the time you need, and every document to verify." As they left the office, the storm that had threatened all morning finally broke. Through the limousine windows, they watched the Bennett mansion recede, carrying a new set of truths to untangle. "What do we do now?" Sophie asked softly. Thomas squeezed her hand like he'd done 1,000 times before. "What we've always done, we do it together." In the front seat, Diana made quick phone calls, discreetly cancelling the legal actions they had prepared. The truth, as always, was more complex than it first appeared. Back in his study, Paul Bennett watched the storm through the window, the portrait of Elena silently observing yet another chapter in their complicated family saga. On his desk, next to the revealing documents, lay an old Time magazine featuring Sophie and Thomas on the cover. "You were right, Elena," he murmured to the portrait. "They didn't need money. They only needed each other." The Bennett Mansion's library looked just as Sophie and Thomas remembered. Floor-to-ceiling mahogany shelves, a spiral iron staircase, the comforting smell of old books. But now, as they sat facing Paul with a storm raging outside, it felt strangely alien. "I need you to understand," Paul said, opening a worn leather folder. "It all started with a phone call. 16 years ago, as 3 in the morning when the phone rang, Paul was still in his office, reviewing contracts. "Paul," Elena's voice shook. "We need help." He remembered that conversation clearly. The ruined investments, the mounting debts, the desperation in his sister's voice. "I put everything into the Meridian Fund," she confessed. "Everything, Paul. The kids' savings was the house money." "Meridian?" Paul felt his blood run cold. "Elena, that fund's under federal investigation." I know now." She started crying. "James tried to get something back. We took out more loans, but it only got worse. Present. Your mother was frantic to fix things before anyone found out," Paul explained, spreading the old papers on the table. "The accident happened before we could find a solution." Sophie picked up one document with trembling hands, a foreclosure notice dated 1 week after her parents' deaths. "Why didn't you tell us?" Thomas asked, his voice tight with contained emotion. "Why let us believe you were the bad guy?" Paul moved to the window, lightning revealing his exhausted expression. "Because sometimes it's easier to direct anger at me than to accept your parents could make such a catastrophic mistake. 10 years ago, remembered watching from afar as Sophie won her first art contest, the one he'd secretly financed. That same month, another debt collection letter arrived, another parental debt he'd have to pay quietly. "Sir," his accountant warned again, "this can't go on." "We'll find a way," Paul insisted, present. "Every scrap of money I could save went to you," Paul said. "Anonymous donations, scholarships, supplies." "Crumbs," Thomas muttered. "All I could do without raising suspicion," Paul reiterated. "If the creditors discovered new funds, they would have seized them." Silence fell, broken only by the thunder outside. Sophie gazed at the desk where old photos lay scattered, her parents smiling, unaware of the tragedy looming. Paul took a slow breath. "I'm sorry. For all of it. For not trusting you. For thinking you had to be protected from the truth." Sophie and Thomas exchanged a look, one of those silent exchanges that had always bound them together. Their expressions were conflicted, but less angry. "We haven't forgiven you," Sophie said honestly. "But maybe we can start understanding. And maybe," Thomas added, "it's time we all learn to trust each other." Outside, the storm raged, but inside the library, a sort of calm settled. Years of resentment, secrets, and misunderstandings couldn't be undone in a single night. "I'll show you everything," Paul offered. "Bank statements, phone records, the rest of your parents' files, whatever you need." Thunder rattled the windows. Sophie closed her eyes, a sudden memory of that stormy night she and Thomas had run away. Only now she felt less like running. The conversation lasted until dawn. By the time the storm finally moved on, the siblings had sifted through enough documents to realize how much of their parents' final months had been consumed by panic and regret. "They wanted to protect us," Sophie murmured, scanning her mom's handwritten notes. "But everything spiraled, and I tried to protect you from the truth," Paul added. In my own clumsy, misguided way, morning light broke through the library windows. They were all exhausted, physically and emotionally. "We should rest," Margaret suggested softly, appearing with a tray of tea. "You can't solve a lifetime of problems in one night." The twins rose, stepping away from the mountains of files. Paul seemed hesitant, unsure whether to approach them. Sophie and Thomas paused by the door, turning back. "Thank you," Sophie said, her voice hoarse from hours of talking. "For telling us." Paul gave a short nod. "You deserve the truth, at the very least." Together, the twins walked upstairs to the same guest rooms they'd once slept in as frightened 5-year-olds. Only now they weren't quite so frightened, and the bedrooms weren't so cold. They fell asleep in their own rooms for the first time in the Bennett mansion, lulled by the lingering rumble of distant thunder, minds buzzing with revelations too big to fully grasp. The following weeks blurred with intense work on both sides. Sophie and Thomas spent hours reviewing the complex tapestry of debts and fraudulent schemes their parents had unwittingly fallen into. Paul opened Bennett Enterprises' archives to them fully. "We have to come clean," Thomas insisted during a meeting. "The media is sniffing around. Sooner or later, they'll find out." Paul looked at the documents spread across the conference table. "Are you sure you want to risk the scandal? The damage could be immense." "Yes," Sophie said firmly. "We're not building on lies anymore." Diana worked with Bennett Enterprises' legal team to craft a statement. The plan to disclose the family's troubled financial past openly transformed the old secrecy into a redemption arc. "If we do this right," Diana explained, "the narrative becomes about how the Bennett family overcame tragedy and built something new." Together, they wrote press releases, prepared interviews, and organized financial records to be posted publicly. "I'll stand with you," Paul told them, glancing at Elena's portrait on the wall. "We face the storm together." On the day of the press conference, journalists crowded the Bennett Enterprises auditorium. Sophie and Thomas stood at the podium with Paul beside them, a sight no one would have predicted years before. "My sister and I once believed we had been abandoned," Thomas began. "We learned the story was more complicated," Sophie continued, voice steady. "Today, we're here to set the record straight about our family and our company's future." Cameras flashed as they revealed the truth: the failed investments, the trust fund that never existed, the debts Paul had quietly shouldered. It was raw, it was messy, but it was real. "For all his faults," Sophie concluded, "Paul Bennett tried to spare us a burden he believed we weren't ready to carry. I can't say I agree with his methods, but I can say I understand them now." Paul stepped forward, hands clasped. "In keeping these secrets, I hurt the two people I was trying to protect. And I'm sorry." Questions came in a barrage. Diana and the legal team deftly fielded the financial ones, while the twins handled queries about textiles' role in the new Bennett partnership. "We're combining the resources of Bennett Enterprises and textile," Thomas explained to one reporter, "merging traditional manufacturing and innovative wearable tech. We're calling it Bennett Textile Global," Sophie added, "a company that stands for transparency, transformation, and, hopefully, second chances." The headlines were mixed. Some highlighted the scandal. Others focused on the redemption. But, to everyone's surprise, the market responded positively. seeing potential in a family story that had finally embraced honesty. "Your stock is up 10%, one of Bennett's executives informed Paul. "Investors love a comeback story." Slowly, the dust began to settle. Paul and the twins worked side by side, reorganizing operations. Employees noticed a new atmosphere of openness. Margaret, smiling as she served coffee, said she'd never seen the old mansion so lively. "Sometimes it feels like a whole new place," she commented to Thomas one morning. "In a way, it is," he replied, glancing at Sophie down the hall, who was in deep conversation with the head of marketing about an upcoming product launch. Claire Peterson arrived unannounced one afternoon, hugging Sophie and Thomas before greeting Paul with a polite nod. "I see a lot has changed," she said, surveying the office, "and not just the decor." Paul cleared his throat. "Thank you, Claire, for everything you did for my niece and nephew." She gave him a long look. "It's nice to finally see you stepping up for them, Mr. Bennett." Over the ensuing months, Bennett Textile Global unveiled product after product: office attire with built-in health monitors, children's clothing that adjusted to growth spurts, sports gear that minimized injury risk. Each success brought them closer, forging a bond through countless late nights, arguments, and breakthroughs. Slowly, what had been fractured began to mend. One evening, Sophie discovered Paul alone in the library, looking at an old family photo album. She joined him quietly. "There's one photo I keep coming back to," he said, tapping a picture of Elena holding Sophie and Thomas as babies. "I wasn't there when it was taken." Sophie studied the image. "None of us can go back and fix what we missed." "No," Paul agreed, "but at least we can move forward without more lies." The true turning point came at a charity gala textile organized for St. Francis' home. Sophie and Thomas insisted the event take place in the Bennett mansion's once intimidating ballroom. "It's symbolic," Sophie explained, as workers set up displays of the twins' earliest art and coding projects. "From a place that once scared us to a place we now share with the world." Guests included major tech figures, fashion icons, even old friends from the shelter. Lucy wore one of Sophie's adaptive dresses, while Miguel showcased a new invention he developed in college. Claire circulated, proud as a parent, introducing donors to the accomplishments of the Reynolds twins, who were no longer children in need of rescue, but innovators inspiring others. During the event, Thomas took the stage to present a check to Sister Maria, who still ran St. Francis' home. The funds were enough to expand the shelter's facilities and computer lab. "We owe so much to you," Thomas said, voice thick with emotion. "This place gave us a second chance when we had nowhere else to go." Sophie joined him, tears in her eyes as she announced the opening of a permanent art studio for the children. "I want every kid to have the chance to draw their dreams," she said. Applause thundered. Paul, standing near the back, pressed a hand over his heart, an unfamiliar tightness there, as though finally allowing himself to feel pride, sorrow, and hope all at once. The night ended with a slideshow of the twins' journey, from old photos at the Reynolds house to the busy halls of textile. The final slide showed them side by side with Paul, unveiling the new Bennett Textile Global logo. "We've come a long way," Sophie whispered to Thomas. "And we're not done yet," he replied, smiling through misty eyes. As the guests departed, Paul lingered, looking up at the mansion's high ceilings. He found Sophie and Thomas in the library, relaxing amid the leftover decorations. "You threw a wonderful party," he said awkwardly. Sophie laughed softly. "We had good help." Thomas closed the book he was leafing through, one of Elena's journals. "We've been reading some of her old notes. She was so excited about traveling the world and exploring, trying new things." Paul nodded. "She was always the brave one." For a moment, none of them spoke. The old tension was gone, replaced by something else, fragile but hopeful. "So," Sophie said, clearing her throat, "what happens next?" Paul glanced at them both. "Whatever we want. We've rebuilt a family. We've started a new chapter." On the wall of the newly revamped office, Sophie's art installation perfectly captured the essence of their journey. 3 separate lines that, after many detours, finally converged in a harmonious pattern. In the end, the true Bennett legacy was not found in numbers on a screen or property deeds. It was in lessons learned, that families can break and mend, that forgiveness is both a choice and a path, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is simply to try again. That night, as the city lights sparkled outside, three people who had traveled a long road from pain to healing shared more than just a name or a business empire. They shared a promise of a future built not on secrets and resentment, but on truth, understanding, and the kind of love that only emerges after learning how to forgive.